China is an impending failure, cloaked by hubris wrapped in a threat. That threat is real and must be taken seriously, but we'll peel back that threatening public face to reveal a hubris that is the most enduring characteristic of a regime that is committed to nothing more than its own continuation, and by any means necessary. What that hubris is trying to hide is a pending failure on a grand scale. And whether that failure comes in 4 years or 4 decades, you won't be surprised because you've come to take the gold pill. The two major parties in the media can no longer be expected to represent our interests. They control the information we receive in order to keep us comfortable with their profits and with their power. Comfort is not what I offer, only the truth, nothing more. China is headed for an economic failure. We know this on both a philosophical level as well as on a level that we can already observe. Of course, the philosophy of the government in China is one of a totalitarian regime. They believe that they should be making decisions to drive everything that's important in the economy, particularly investment. The good news is that compared to a couple of generations ago when the government only cared about Marxism, only cared about class warfare, and didn't have the slightest interest, much less knowledge, about what led to economic growth, today they prioritize growth. They understand that growth comes from investment. The problem is that they make investment decisions at the governmental level without having anywhere near the amount of information that they would need to do so efficiently. As we know, as libertarians, as Austrian economists, you cannot process the amount of information required to make efficient decisions the way free markets can. You cannot accomplish this at a governmental level. The Chinese government will never have the foresight, the curiosity of an entrepreneurial community. And because of the culture that the Chinese government fosters throughout the nation, no time soon will they ever have an entrepreneurial community develop. They don't have the advantage of a churn of what Schumpeter called creative destruction. Investments that work, investments that don't work, trying new things, looking for what will provide efficiency and growth in the economy. It's always one big bet made with one big decision. Yes, it is true that the Chinese economy has exhibited very high growth rates over the past 20 years. But this is growth in GDP, and remember what GDP is, a measure of expenditure. That includes investment. The Chinese government has been driving tremendous amounts of investment over this past generation. We see huge investment in residential property, homes, office buildings, retail space. But there's no reason to believe that these decisions will turn out to be efficient in the long run, that they will foster growth, that they will drive growth. Already we see mismatches between where these properties should have been developed and where they are currently under development. We see empty office space, empty residential space. Choosing a single sector or a couple of sectors, placing huge bets on those, and then hoping that they'll drive economic growth is old-fashioned thinking. The World Bank used to do this in Latin America and many Asian countries 20 years ago, 40 years ago. In the long run, it didn't work. The only thing that works is free market deregulation, allowing capitalism to take hold, and for the information that's closest to the markets to be used to make the decisions about where investments should take place and what types of investments are necessary. The biggest example of the Chinese government driving investment is what they call their Belt and Road Initiative. This is a massive investment set to last over 35 years, starting from something like 7 or 8 years ago, estimated to continue until the middle of the century. The Chinese government is predicting that what will be important from now through the rest of the entirety of the 21st century is their ability to cheaply and efficiently move exports, move things around the world. This project will construct in something like 70 countries, in addition to China, transportation infrastructure, roads, railways, trains, seaports, ships. The idea is to make a heavy bet on what they believe will be the future, but to apparently do so based on 20th century business. China is betting on its ability to sell stuff, manufactured goods, to the rest of the world and to be able to sell a lot of it. Enough to earn the money it needs, the foreign exchange currency that it would need, to buy high-tech products, software and hardware, from the rest of the world. This means that the more developed world, the Western world, will have to be in the business of making information products. Which business would you want to be in? 20th century manufacturing or 21st century information products? Which is going to likely exhibit higher margins, higher growth rates? Which is going to drive wages up for your population? Which is going to value the education and therefore drive the education of your population? In effect, China is economically ceding the 21st century to the West, to the United States in particular. Why? China has an ulterior motive, a big one. The Belt and Road Initiative, investing in 70 countries, Asia, Africa, Latin America, is meant to tie these countries together in a sort of a family. Family is the word that was used by the Chinese government recently. China wants to extend its influence over these nations, to extend its culture of surveillance, to tie everybody together commercially, to increase the dependence on China of these countries for goods and services, for finance. Many of these countries are already, now that the Belt and Road investments have begun, many of these countries are already significantly indebted to the government of China. In the future, these countries will be virtually unable to resist any investments that China wants to make in those places, including militarily. China is building an empire. China is building a commercial empire and possibly more. History teaches us that this is a failing proposition, and we don't need to go as far back as the fall of the British Empire. We can look at the Soviet Union. When the Soviet Union fell and the Iron Curtain was lifted and we could see the economic conditions of the countries that had been operating as a family, what we saw were countries that had specialized in what it was that Russia needed, what it was that was needed behind the Iron Curtain. They were not engaged with the rest of the world. The biggest, saddest, perhaps, example was Czechoslovakia, which, in a free market society, were it not for being under the Soviet sphere, remember they weren't actually technically part of the Soviet Union, but they were certainly on the wrong side of the Iron Curtain. Were they not, they would have been competing with German engineering technology and German highly engineered manufacturing. Instead, Czechoslovakia was selling engineered products to Russia and to the Soviet Union. They were in sad shape, ill-prepared to compete with the rest of the world when the Berlin Wall fell. For these reasons, I worry more than for China, I worry more for their African and Asian and Latin American partners. We often envy, when we see abroad, strange cultures that seem to be driving economic growth in interesting new ways that escape us here in the United States, mostly because of the way GDP is measured, but because it's one thing to drive big GDP numbers for a few years, it's another to sustain them for a long time. Look at Japan in the 1980s, exhibiting a culture that we found fascinating. The idea of long-term employment contracts that were swiftly slipping away from employees in the United States. As the United States deunionized, Japan was still involved with the idea of long-term employee relationships with their employers. In a matter of a decade after our initial fascination in the early 80s, the Japanese model failed. It was mismatched to the rapidly changing world, unable to react quickly to changing technologies, changing markets. As the information products society, the information products world came upon us, Japan was in no position to react as quickly as the United States and many other Western countries were. The truth of the matter is that while it's only 2021 today, already we can see that America is owning the 21st century. We did not make the cultural mistakes of Japan. We do have unions that need to be worked on. As I've talked about, police unions, teachers unions, we have employee relationship problems in the United States, but we escaped the cultural problems that precluded us in the commercial sector from making the quick changes, the entrepreneurial adjustments that we needed to make. Foreign investments made in the private sector in the United States are welcome from all over the world. This sets us apart from China, where it's still difficult for foreigners to make investments. We're good at bringing in intellectual property from abroad, something that China wishes very much that they were very good at, but China is not some place where people want to do business when it means giving up their intellectual property. Not only are we open to foreigners making investments in the United States, but the U.S. government does not get in our way when we make investments abroad. The Chinese government makes this mistake as well. We have tax code problems that we need to fix so that we can start avoiding the double taxation that some companies face when investing abroad. But on the whole, the United States does a much better job of allowing free markets to work, and this is the reason why we are leading technological innovation and investment and GDP growth in the 21st century. So what explains the Chinese government's tolerance of this slow but certain movement toward economic catastrophe? And why is this problem unlikely to get fixed? These trillion-dollar bets are abject losers when you look at it from the standpoint of economic growth. But if you look at it through the lens of regime preservation, which is the only thing that the regime cares about, things begin to make a lot more sense. Maximization of control is what the Chinese government believes will advance their opportunities for self-preservation. And this is what explains their decisions much better than the idea of maximizing welfare the way you might expect a democracy to behave. The regime that governs China is not, in an American sense, what we would call patriotic. The government does not see the society as being bound together by some shared commitment to an ideology of pluralistic tolerance, individual liberty, equal protection under the law. Like we view ourselves in the United States as imperfect, clearly, as imperfect as we are at pursuing those things. These are the roots of what we consider to be our nation and our reasons for patriotism. In China, they view themselves as a relatively homogeneous culture, racially homogeneous. Patriotism there sometimes takes the face of a nativist, racist even, outlook. Patriotism is often taking the form of what we would call xenophobia. The government there feels very much threatened by what they can't control, what they don't understand, by outsiders in general. And remember, a non-democracy has no reason to view something like a transition of power as being patriotic. Indeed, the regime in China has sufficient hubris to believe that they are what's best for China. They know what's best. They honestly believe, typically, that any regime change would actually be bad for the people. This is, at the most fundamental level, what justifies placing the welfare of the people second when making big decisions to the idea of self-preservation of the regime itself. There are many examples in which the Chinese regime reveals itself to be more interested in self-preservation, more interested in control than in maximizing the welfare of its population. The Belt and Road Initiative is but one example, albeit a large example. The investments here are commercially suspect, but set the stage for the Chinese regime to extend its influence, its control around the world, including the possibility of converting seaports to military installations throughout Asia and possibly in places in Africa. A second example is Hong Kong. Beijing imposing self-rule, violating the agreement that had been in place to allow Hong Kong self-determination. This is not something that is set up to maximize the welfare of Hong Kongers. This violation is nothing more than an exertion of the regime's belief that political suppression is necessary to keep control of that population. A third example, the Wuhan lab incident. Let's assume that this was some sort of mistake for the moment, please. If we find out that it was some sort of intentionally evil act, all bets are off. We'll have to discuss it in a completely new video cast. Assuming this was a mistake, clearly the Chinese government covered it up, lied about it to the rest of the world initially, including shutting down cell phone coverage around the epicenter of the incident. These are not actions that one takes if one is interested primarily in the welfare, the health, the benefit of one's population. This is about control of the flow of information intended to advance the interest of self-preservation of the regime itself. What about the program to collect DNA? The government admits having collected DNA samples from something like 100 million men already in China, with the objective of collecting samples from everybody, from all the men. I don't exactly understand why it's men only. Controlling the male half of the population certainly doesn't control the intellectual half of the population, but the objective cannot be seen as anything but control. This is not something that's being put in place to advance the well-being of the population. The government claims that these DNA samples are being collected on a voluntary basis, which of course makes no sense at all. Under a regime in which the government controls everything, there's no such thing as voluntary cooperation. We all know what happens to families that say no when the government asks for virtually anything. Opportunities, access to employment and relocation, residential opportunities, these are compromised when one says no to the Chinese government. The surveillance program is another example. Cameras are now pervasive throughout every major city in China and most cities that we would count as secondary. The Chinese government claims that this is something that is done to fight crime, which of course is insane. There's no reason for this much collection of data. It's all being run through artificial intelligence software with the intent of facial recognition and storage, the association of images with names to be able to control the population. The idea here is to know what political activities are being undertaken with the idea of being able to suppress those in the future. The Chinese regime not only disregards individual liberty, but has fostered a culture of utter disregard even for the value of human life. The Uyghur suppression is Exhibit A in this regard. Increasingly, the suppression looks more and more like a genocide. The regime exhibits every characteristic of paranoia, of racism, failing to understand the basic principles of economics, even as it undertakes actions that are the same things that drive populist fear of immigration all over the world. Just a fundamental misunderstanding of the value of human life. Another example is the one-child policy. The long-run implication suggests that the United States will dominate the second half of the century as well. What's going to happen to China when the ratio of old people to young people goes sky high? Has no one learned anything about the problem in the United States of the Social Security system? Every country in the world that tries to take care of its retirees knows that the ratio of young people to old people needs to be monitored very closely. There's no reason economically why someone would suppress the population to one child per family unless one absolutely did not understand how economics works, coupled with absolute disregard for the value of human life. Over and over again, the Chinese regime exhibits interest in self-preservation. The Communist Party is in charge in China, a party of principle. We're very proud to be able to call the Libertarian Party a party of principle, but make no mistake, we are not the only party of principle. The difference is that in China, the principle is different. They have a principle not based on the nexus of freedom and prosperity as identified by Austrian economists, right? They have a principle of control. But I would not suppose anyone in China, in the regime, who is able to read Road to Serfdom would argue with the mechanics of the Road to Serfdom. They're already at serfdom. Their big concern is that the road will lead the other direction. What happens when the road leads from serfdom instead of to serfdom? The regime is absolutely consumed with the idea of control because they're afraid that the road will go both ways. It is in the context of this need for control, this Chinese regime of paranoia, that we must realize that the Chinese government is already at war with much of the rest of the world, including the United States. The hacking program that has been launched against the Western world is large, it is widespread, it is aggressive, it is state-sponsored, it is well-funded by the governmental regime in China. It is purposeful, it is damaging, it is expensive, both in the private sector and the public sector in the United States and in our Western allies. We should be finding ways to face down these threats, these acts of aggression, which would be, make no mistake, acts of war, and labeled as such were they not merely digital. We must find digital force to face these down. Other actions taken by the regime inside the United States that could, in any other era, be labeled acts of war include the harassment that members of the Chinese diaspora have to put up with. In many cases, citizens of the United States who were born in China and naturalized citizens of the United States, certainly individuals with residency in the United States, put up with harassment by the Chinese regime to either spy on U.S. companies, U.S. governmental entities, or to return to China altogether. China is consumed not only with the idea of control, but the idea of controlling and collecting as much intellectual property as possible, with no regard, of course, for ownership rights over that intellectual property, no matter where it is, in the United States or elsewhere. The goal of Chinese aggression is to set up a commercial empire and prepare to defend it militarily. We need to be prepared for China to try to extend its military presence throughout Asia and potentially farther, including places in Africa. As far as the commercial empire goes, we should let them. We should be trying to take advantage of the cheap goods that they will be able to provide to the Western world. And we should be training our people to leave the 20th century behind. It is in this context of paranoia that we must realize the Chinese threat is born. It's out of fear. It is not out of an attempt to advance the welfare of their people. When negotiating with the Chinese regime, we are not engaged with something similar to a Western power trying to get the best deal possible. It is about control, influence, and extension of that control and influence outside of China. This means that we must be willing and able to defend ourselves from the aggression, but resist policies that shoot ourselves in the foot with, for example, trade wars or restrictions on investments either made in the United States or in China or anywhere else that impose costs on our own citizens without stopping the Chinese regime from taking the actions that they want to take. We need to resist actions that we are engaged in just for punitive measures or simply out of retribution. These don't work. Resisting these measures by our own government won't be easy. Politics in the United States has become a battleground. On one side are politicians and pundits, regulators and revisionists, jurists and journalists who believe that the government is better able to solve our problems for us than we are ourselves. On our side of this battle are things like science, history, people like you, people like me, and common sense. Thanks for helping me make this sense a little bit more common, and thanks for coming to take the gold pill. Comfort is not what I offer, only the truth, nothing more.